Mr. Lawson was a man who had everything that most people only dreamed of. He had money, a big house with tall white pillars at the front, fast cars that sparkled under the sunlight, and respect wherever he went. People in town often spoke about him with admiration, calling him the man who had built his fortune from nothing. He was known as a millionaire, someone who lived in comfort and success, yet, behind the shiny walls of his mansion and the wide gates that protected it, his life was not as perfect as it looked from the outside. Every morning, Mr. Lawson's day started early. He would wake up, dress in a fine suit, and leave for his business trips or meetings before the sun had risen too high. His schedule was always full and his phone seemed to ring endlessly. Friends often joked that he lived more in airplanes and hotels than in his own house. Even his neighbors sometimes forgot he lived there. Because they rarely saw him, the mansion was beautiful but often empty. The grand staircase, the golden chandeliers, the long dining table, and the expensive paintings on the wall all stood in silence most of the time. The sound of footsteps rarely echoed except for one person's. Clara, the maid who had worked there for nearly 10 years. She was a quiet woman, simple in her ways, and she took care of the house with steady hands. Her job was to make sure everything remained spotless, that the garden stayed fresh, and that the house never lost its beauty. Mr. Lawson trusted Clara. He didn't speak much to her, but he knew she was loyal and hardworking. For him, she was part of the background of his life, always present but never in the spotlight. She never complained, never asked for more, and never failed in her duties. Whenever he returned from his long trips, he found the house in perfect order, as if no time had passed, but behind his strong appearance, there was a part of Mr. Lawson's life that money and success could never fix. Years ago, he had lost his wife, the woman who had stood beside him when he had nothing. She had seen his struggles, believed in him when no one else did, and celebrated every step of his rise. Her passing had left a deep hole in his heart. Even though people thought he had moved on,
He had not. His smile was polite, his words were controlled.
but inside he carried a loneliness that even the grandest mansion could not hide. Clara knew this better than anyone else. She had been there on the days after his wife's death. She had watched him walk through the halls of the house with a silence that was heavier than any words. She noticed how he avoided certain rooms, how he looked away from old photographs, and how he always kept himself busy, as though stopping for too long would open a door to memories he did not want to face. Clara never spoke of it, but she noticed everything. The town, however, only saw the surface. They saw a man of power and wealth, a man who always wore a fine suit, drove a polished car, and never seemed weak. They did not see the nights when he sat alone in his office with a glass of wine, staring at the empty chair across from him. They did not hear the silence of his dinners, where no laughter or voices filled the air. On this particular day, as the story begins, Mr. Lawson had just returned from another business trip. He had planned to arrive home late at night, but a sudden change of plans brought him back much earlier. The flight he was supposed to take was canceled, and instead of waiting, he decided to drive home. The long road stretched out before him, and he felt a strange pull, as though fate wanted him back at his mansion sooner than expected. As his car rolled into the driveway, he felt a sense of relief, though he could not explain why. Maybe it was the thought of sleeping in his own bed for once, or maybe it was something deeper, something that waited for him inside without his knowing. The house stood tall and proud under the afternoon sun, its windows shining like eyes that had been waiting. Inside, Clara was moving about her usual work, unaware that her employer would soon step through the door much earlier than she had expected. To her, it was just another quiet day, but for Mr. Lawson, it was the start of something that would change the way he looked at loyalty, kindness, and the meaning of family. Clara had never imagined that her life would lead her to work in a mansion as grand as Mr. Lawson's. She came from a small village, far away from the noise of the city. Her parents were poor farmers, and from the time she was a child, she understood the meaning of hard work. She learned to wake up early, help in the fields, and take care of her younger siblings. Life had been simple but never easy. When she was old enough, Clara moved to the city to find work. At first, she cleaned small houses, washed clothes for neighbors, and took whatever job she could find to send money back home. She never thought of herself as unlucky. She accepted her life as it was. But inside her heart, she always dreamed of stability, a place where she could feel safe. That dream came true when she was hired by Mr. Lawson nearly 10 years ago. At first, she was nervous. The mansion was enormous, with rooms bigger than her entire family home. The tall windows, the chandeliers, and the long hallways felt intimidating. She was worried she might make mistakes or fail to meet the expectations of such a rich man. But Mr. Lawson's late wife had been the one who welcomed her. Clara remembered her kindness clearly. She had smiled warmly and told her, "Just do your best. That is all we ask." Those words gave Clara courage. The years passed, and Clara became a quiet part of the household. She kept to herself, never gossiping. Never crossing lines, she treated the house with care, almost as if it was her own. She polished the floors until they shone, dusted the paintings with delicate hands, and made sure the garden always bloomed. She took pride in her work, and that pride showed in every corner of the mansion. But as the seasons changed, Clara also noticed the changes in the man she worked for. When Mrs. Lawson was alive, the house felt warm and alive. Clara remembered the laughter at dinner, the smell of fresh bread from the kitchen, and the soft music that sometimes filled the living room. Mr. Lawson, though busy, always made time for his wife. Together they shared a bond that was visible even to a maid standing quietly in the background. When Mrs. Lawson passed away, it was as if a curtain of silence fell over the house. Clara would never forget the day of the funeral. Mr. Lawson stood tall, but his eyes were empty. He shook hands with people who came to give their condolences, but he barely spoke when the last guest left. He walked inside and closed the door, and from then on the mansion was never the same. In the months that followed, Clara carried on with her work. She made sure the house remained spotless, but she felt the emptiness more than anyone. The dining table that once held 2 people now only had 1 chair pulled out. The music stopped. The smell of fresh bread disappeared sometimes. When she passed by the study late at night, she saw Mr. Lawson sitting alone, staring at old photographs. A glass of wine untouched on the table. Clara never disturbed him, but her heart ached for him. She respected the boundary between employer and maid, yet in her own way she cared for him. She polished his late wife's favorite vase carefully, not because she had to, but because she knew it mattered to him. She kept the garden roses blooming because Mrs. Lawson had loved roses. These were small gestures, but for Clara, they were her silent way of keeping the memory of the woman alive. For Mr. Lawson, Clara was a steady presence he rarely thought about. He saw her as dependable and trustworthy, but he never really looked deeper. He was too wrapped in his own world, his work and his silent grief. He assumed Clara was just doing her job, but in truth, her care for the house came from something more. She believed that serving a home also meant serving the heart of the people inside it. Despite her quiet loyalty, Clara carried her own burdens. She had no family in the city. Her siblings had grown up, and her parents were old now. The money she earned went back to them. She lived a life of simplicity, wearing the same plain clothes, eating alone in the small quarters of the mansion, and never indulging in anything fancy. While the house sparkled with wealth, her own life was as modest as it had always been, yet she never complained. Her neighbors and friends sometimes asked her why she stayed so long in one job. Clara only smiled and said, "Because some places are more than just work." They didn't understand what she meant, but in her heart she knew. The mansion wasn't just walls and floors to her. It was a place full of memories, of love that had once lived there, and of a man who, though distant, deserved kindness. And so, as Mr. Lawson drove back home unexpectedly that afternoon, Clara was inside, busy with her routine. She had no idea that her loyalty, her quiet heart, and her silent gestures were about to be seen in a way they had never been before. She thought it was just another day, but it would soon become the day that revealed the true bond between a wealthy man and the maid he had long taken for granted. The afternoon sun was still high when Mr. Lawson turned his car toward the long road that led to his mansion. He had not planned to be there at that hour. His flight had been canceled due to weather, and the next available one was not until much later. Instead of waiting at a hotel, he decided to return home. It had been a long week of meetings, handshakes, and endless numbers. He felt tired, his shoulders heavy, but there was also a strange sense of calm as the car wheels rolled across familiar ground. He usually returned home late at night when the house was dark and silent. Clara would have finished her work hours earlier, and the mansion would be still. His footsteps would echo across empty hallways as he made his way to his room. But this time was different. The day was still bright, and the air smelled fresh with the sweetness of garden flowers. It felt unusual, almost like he was about to step into a place that was not quite the same as he had left it. When he entered the driveway, something caught his eye. The garden lights were on, glowing softly even though the sun had not yet set. He frowned. Clara never wasted electricity. She was careful with such things. He slowed the car and stared. The trimmed hedges stood tall, and the roses bloomed with color. But the warm glow of the lamps in the daylight looked strange. As he stepped out of the car, faint sounds reached his ears. Music, soft and gentle, drifted from inside the house. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for him to notice. He paused, his hand resting on the car door. Clara never played music while she worked, at least not that he had ever seen or heard. A part of him grew suspicious. He thought of the possibilities. Had she invited someone over? Was there a gathering he did not know about? His mansion had always been a private space, one that few people entered. He felt his chest tighten as his polished shoes clicked against the stone pathway. The front door opened easily. Clara always left it unlocked during the day while she moved between the garden and the kitchen. The moment he stepped inside, the music grew clearer. It was a soft melody, one he hadn't heard in years. His heart skipped a beat when he realized it was the very song his wife used to play on the old piano. His breath caught in his throat for a moment. He thought his mind was playing tricks on him. But no, the music was real, and it floated through the air like a memory come alive. He followed the sound quietly, his footsteps careful, his body tense with curiosity. The sight that greeted him in the living room stopped him in his tracks. The long dining table, which usually sat unused and covered in dust-free cloth, was transformed. A white tablecloth had been spread across it. Fresh flowers sat in the center in a glass vase, and plates of homemade food covered the surface. Steam rose from warm dishes, filling the air with the smell of herbs and freshly baked bread. At the very center of the table stood a cake, simple but carefully made. The words written in neat icing across the top made his throat tighten even more. Happy anniversary, Mr. and Mrs. Lawson. His knees felt weak. He gripped the side of a chair to steady himself. His mind swirled. Why would Clara do this? How did she even remember? He had never spoken about the date to anyone, not even his closest friends. Yet here it was, a memory he had locked away, laid out before him on the table. Clara appeared from the kitchen just then, carrying a tray with 2 glasses. She froze when she saw him standing there. The look of surprise on her face quickly turned to worry. She had not expected him to return so soon. Mr. Lawson, she whispered, her voice trembling. You're home early. He did not answer at once. His eyes moved from her to the table and back again. The silence between them stretched. Clara lowered her gaze. Unsure whether she had made a mistake, finally he spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. What is all this? Clara set the tray down with careful hands. She folded her fingers together and took a breath. I know today is your anniversary, she said softly. I thought maybe it would comfort you if the house didn't feel so empty. Her words pierced through him. For years he had carried his grief quietly, never allowing anyone to see, and yet here was Clara, a woman he had barely spoken more than polite words to, bringing to life a memory he thought only he carried. The smell of the food, the glow of the lights, the music that stirred his heart. It all came together in that moment. His chest ached, but not in the way it usually did on this day. Instead, it was an ache mixed with gratitude, with the strange warmth of being seen. He sat down slowly, his eyes still fixed on the cake. Clara stood silently by the side, unsure if she should stay or leave. She had never crossed the invisible line between them before, but today she had. She waited for his judgment, her heart beating fast, and for the first time in years, Mr. Lawson felt something shift inside him. Something had broken through the walls of silence he had built. Mr. Lawson sat in silence for several moments, the kind of silence that carried both weight and meaning. His eyes stayed fixed on the table, on the food, on the cake that bore words he had not dared to speak aloud in years. The house, which had so often felt cold and hollow, now seemed alive, filled with warmth he could not explain. Clara stood near the corner of the room, her hands folded tightly in front of her. She did not know whether she should excuse herself or wait for him to speak. She had never crossed such a line before. Her work had always been about dusting, sweeping, polishing, and serving quietly in the background. Today she had allowed her heart to guide her, and now she wasn't sure if that was a mistake. Finally, Mr. Lawson's voice broke the silence. It was low, almost hesitant. Clara, he said slowly, why would you do this? Her head lifted slightly, her eyes wide but gentle. Because I remember, she answered. I remember how Mrs. Lawson used to love this day. She would talk to me in the kitchen while I worked. She would say it was her favorite time of the year, because it reminded her how far you both had come together. He blinked, his throat tightening again. He had not known that his wife had spoken to Clara about such things. He imagined her smiling, laughing in the kitchen while Clara cleaned, and the picture filled him with both pain and comfort. I didn't mean to upset you, Clara continued softly. I just thought, maybe it shouldn't be a sad day. Maybe it could still hold something good. Mr. Lawson leaned back in his chair, his hands resting against the edge of the table. He stared at the flickering light of the candles Clara had placed near the flowers. His chest felt heavy, but in a way that brought tears closer than anger. You remembered more than I did, he admitted in a whisper, almost to himself. I had planned to bury myself in work today, as I always do, but you brought her memory back into this house. Clara lowered her eyes, feeling her cheeks grow warm. She deserves to be remembered, she said. And so do you. For a moment, the two of them stood at the edge of something unfamiliar. Mr. Lawson had always kept distance between himself and his maid. Clara had always respected the line, yet in that moment the line blurred. Not because of wealth or duty, but because of shared humanity. He gestured toward the chair across from him, the one that had been empty for so long. Sit, he said. His voice firm but not unkind. Clara hesitated. Her instinct told her it was not her place. Yet his eyes, tired and softened with emotion, told her it was not a command but an invitation. Slowly, carefully, she pulled out the chair and sat. The sight of her in that seat across from him made his heart twist. It was the place his wife had once filled, and though no one could replace her, he realized the loneliness of that empty chair had haunted him more than he admitted. The food smelled rich and warm. Clara had cooked with care. Every dish was something Mrs. Lawson had once enjoyed. Roasted chicken seasoned with herbs, mashed potatoes creamy and smooth, and fresh bread that filled the air with its comforting scent. Mr. Lawson took a bite, and as the flavors touched his tongue, memories came rushing back, dinner conversations, laughter, gentle teasing between husband and wife. It all seemed to echo faintly in the air around him. You cooked all this yourself? He asked, his voice breaking the quiet. Clara nodded. Yes, I thought it would be right. I learned some of the recipes from Mrs. Lawson. She showed me once. Years ago. He placed his fork down and rubbed his hand against his forehead. She was always teaching others, always sharing. I didn't realize how much of her stayed here even after she was gone. Clara's eyes softened. She never really left, sir. Not in the things she loved. Not in the memories, I think. I think she's still here in some way. Her words lingered in the air, and Mr. Lawson found himself unable to dismiss them. For the first time in years, he allowed the tears to come, not out of weakness, but out of release. Clara did not move or try to comfort him. She simply let the moment be, knowing some grief was meant to be carried alone but not unseen. When the meal was finished, they did not part immediately. Instead, Mr. Lawson found himself talking, slowly at first, then more freely. He spoke about his wife, about the early years when they had struggled to pay bills, about the nights they had stayed up dreaming of a better life, about the joy in her eyes when he had bought this very house. Clara listened quietly, her eyes never leaving his face. She did not interrupt, did not ask questions, she simply listened, and it was more comforting than he had imagined. Hours passed and the sun outside dipped lower. The mansion, once filled with emptiness, now glowed with candlelight and quiet conversation. It felt alive again, as though laughter and warmth had dared to return. When the evening finally drew to a close, Mr. Lawson stood slowly. He looked at Clara, and for the first time in all their years together, he did not see her as just his maid. He saw her as someone who had carried a part of his grief without being asked, someone who had honored his wife's memory in silence. Thank you, he said, his voice firm but gentle. I don't think you know what this means to me. Clara smiled faintly, her hands folded once more. It was nothing, sir. It was only kindness, but he knew it was more than that. It was the beginning of something he had not expected. A bond built not on wealth or duty, but on shared pain, loyalty, and quiet compassion. The next morning, Mr. Lawson woke earlier than usual. The soft light of dawn crept through the curtains, but something about the house felt different. It was not just the food or the music from the night before. It was the feeling that the walls themselves had breathed again. For years, the mansion had felt like a shell, but now it carried warmth, the faint echo of care. He walked slowly down the stairs, his hand brushing against the polished wooden rail. His eyes fell on the dining table, still neatly set from the evening. The cake, half eaten, remained in the center. Its words stared back at him. Happy anniversary, Mr. and Mrs. Lawson. His throat tightened again, but this time the ache was gentler. Clara had left the room spotless, as always. Yet she had been careful not to erase everything from the night. It was as if she wanted him to keep holding on, even if only for a little longer. Later that afternoon, Mr. Lawson decided to stay at home rather than escape to his office. He felt restless, pulled by the memory of the night before. He found Clara in the garden, kneeling by the roses, her hands carefully trimming the stems. The sun caught strands of her dark hair as she worked quietly. For a moment he simply watched her, realizing how little he had ever truly seen her before. "Clara," he called softly. She looked up quickly, startled to see him standing there in casual clothes. For years he had always been in a rush, always dressed sharply, always leaving before she could say more than a polite greeting. Seeing him there, calm and unhurried, felt unusual. "Yes, sir," she asked, brushing the soil from her hands. "Would you walk with me?" he said, his tone hesitant, almost as if the words were unfamiliar to him. Clara blinked in surprise but nodded. She set down her tools and followed him along the stone path that curved through the garden. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, and the smell of earth mixed with the faint perfume of blossoms. For several minutes they walked in silence, Mr. Lawson's hands behind his back. Clara keeping a respectful distance. Finally he spoke, his voice steady but low. "Last night, it was the first time in years that I didn't feel alone in this house." Clara's steps slowed. She glanced at him, unsure if he wanted her to respond. "I'm glad, sir," she said softly. "You don't understand," he continued, his words gathering weight. "Every year, I've drowned myself in work, in numbers, in meetings, anything to avoid this day. I told myself it was strength, that moving forward was the only way. But last night, for the first time, I realized I was running away. I was pretending that remembering her would destroy me when in truth, forgetting her was the real destruction." His words trembled as they escaped him. Clara lowered her eyes. She had felt his loneliness for years but never heard him speak of it so openly. They reached a small bench in the middle of the garden, shaded by an old oak tree. Mr. Lawson sat down slowly and gestured for her to sit as well. Clara hesitated but obeyed. The two of them sat side by side, the silence between them deep but not empty. "I saw the way you cared for this house," he said after a pause. "The way you kept her roses blooming. The way you treated her things with respect. You've been honoring her memory in ways I never noticed. How long have you been doing that?" Clara's voice was soft. "Since the day she passed, sir. I thought it was the least I could do. She was kind to me. She made me feel like I belonged here. Even when I was only the maid, I couldn't let her presence fade so easily." Her words struck him deeply. He pressed a hand against his mouth, trying to steady himself. He realized he had been blind to something precious. For years he had believed himself alone in his grief. Yet here was Clara, carrying it with him silently, never asking for recognition, never asking for thanks. The air between them grew heavy, and then, in a voice that trembled with honesty, Mr. Lawson whispered, "You've done more for me than anyone else has in all these years. Clara, you gave me back something I thought I had lost forever. A reason to remember without breaking." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She quickly wiped them away, but her heart swelled. She had never expected her simple acts of loyalty to mean so much. At that moment, the distance of wealth, status, and position melted away. He was not the millionaire, and she was not just the maid. They were two souls bound by the same love for a woman who had touched them both. Suddenly, a strong wind rustled through the garden, scattering rose petals into the air. For a fleeting second, Mr. Lawson thought of his wife, as if she were there, watching over them. The petals danced around Clara's face, and he felt a surge of something he had not felt in years: connection. The climax of his grief had always been silence and emptiness, but now, in the presence of this quiet, loyal woman, the climax shifted. It became the breaking of chains, the opening of a door he had kept locked. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the rose bush in front of them, pulling one bloom carefully from the stem. He handed it to Clara, his eyes steady. "For you," he said simply. Clara's lips parted in shock. Sir, I can't. You can, he interrupted gently. This house would be nothing without you. I would be nothing without you. The words hung in the air like a confession. Not of love in the romantic sense, but of gratitude, of recognition, of the deep bond that had been born from years of silence. For the first time in 10 years, Mr. Lawson did not feel like a man living in a museum of memories. He felt alive, as though he had stepped into a new chapter, one that he never expected. And Clara, holding the rose close to her chest, felt seen, truly seen in a way she had never imagined. The days that followed were unlike any Mr. Lawson had experienced in years. The mansion, which had so often stood silent, began to feel alive again. It was not because of grand parties or guests filling the hallways, but because of something much simpler, a change in the way he saw the world around him each morning. He found himself noticing the small details Clara had always cared for, but that he had never paid attention to. The roses blooming outside his window, the polished floors that gleamed like glass, the faint smell of fresh bread that sometimes drifted from the kitchen. He realized that these things had always been there, quietly keeping his home from becoming a lifeless shell. It was Clara who had made sure of that. For Clara, the change was just as striking. For 10 years, she had kept her place in the background, always silent, always careful. But now, when she moved through the halls, she felt the weight of his eyes following her, not in judgment but in recognition. He noticed her now. He saw her not just as a maid, but as someone who shared his grief, someone who had quietly protected the memory of his wife when he could not. One evening, Mr. Lawson returned from his office earlier than usual. Instead of retreating into his study, he went straight to the kitchen. Clara looked up in surprise as he entered. He had never done that before. The kitchen had always been her space, her quiet corner of the house. What are you cooking? He asked, his voice lighter than she remembered. Just soup, she replied, a little nervous. It's nothing special. He stepped closer, breathing in the aroma. It smells like the soup she used to make, he said softly. The words made Clara smile. She had indeed used one of Mrs. Lawson's recipes, something she had memorized years ago. For the first time, Mr. Lawson stayed and watched her cook. He even asked if he could help. Clara laughed quietly and handed him a spoon to stir the pot. The sight of the millionaire, dressed in a crisp shirt, carefully stirring soup under her instruction, was something she never thought she would see. It was simple, yet it felt profound, as if a heavy curtain had been lifted from his life. As the weeks passed, Mr. Lawson began to open up more. He spoke about his wife freely, sometimes with tears, sometimes with laughter. He told Clara stories of their early days, when they had lived in a small apartment with cracked walls and broken furniture. He spoke of the nights they had eaten nothing but bread but had been happy because they had each other. Clara listened with patience, her quiet presence a comfort he had not known he needed. But the mansion's transformation was not just about him. Clara, too, found herself changing. For years she had lived quietly, her own dreams tucked away. But now, in the simple moments of sharing meals or conversations, she felt something stir within her. A sense that her life was not just about serving, but also about being part of something bigger. One afternoon, as Clara was tending the roses, Mr. Lawson came to stand beside her. He held a small watering can, awkward in his hands. Show me how you do it, he said. She laughed softly. You just pour gently. Sir, not too much, not too little, he tried. His movements clumsy at first, and Clara smiled, guiding his hand. For a brief moment, their fingers touched, and both of them froze. The air between them shifted. Not romantic, but deeply human. A recognition that they were no longer just master and servant, but two people walking through grief together. Yet, as the bond deepened, so did the whispers in Mr. Lawson's mind. He wondered what others might think if they saw him like this, sharing meals with his maid, walking with her in the garden. He had built a reputation as a powerful man, a man above simple attachments. Would people see weakness in him now? Would they think he had lost his way? One evening, while sitting in his study, he wrestled with these thoughts. The room was filled with shadows, the glow of a lamp casting long lines across the shelves of books. Clara entered quietly, bringing him tea as she often did. She placed it on the desk and turned to leave. But he stopped her. Clara, he said, his voice low. Do you ever wonder what people would say? About this, about us? She froze, her back to him. Then slowly she turned. Her eyes were calm, People will always speak, sir, whether it is good or bad. But what matters is what is true. And the truth is, I have only tried to be kind, nothing more. Her words cut through his doubt. He realized that for years he had lived caring too much about appearances, about how the world saw him. But in the quiet honesty of Clara's presence, he found a truth that mattered more than gossip. The next day, something unusual happened. Mr. Lawson canceled an important meeting. Instead, he stayed home. He joined Clara in the garden, ate the bread she baked, and sat with her as the sun went down. The world outside could wait. For once, his heart told him he was exactly where he needed to be. The falling action of their story was not dramatic. It was simple, quiet, and gentle. Yet it was in that simplicity that Mr. Lawson found what he had been missing all along: connection. Clara had given him back not only his memories but also his life, and in return, he gave her something she had never asked for but always deserved: respect, recognition, and belonging. The weeks turned into months, and the quiet bond between Mr. Lawson and Clara grew into something neither of them had expected. It was not the kind of bond people spoke loudly about, nor one that fit neatly into the world of wealth and social standing. It was deeper, built on trust, loyalty, and the kind of unspoken understanding that few people ever share. For the first time in years, Mr. Lawson no longer dreaded coming home. Before, his mansion had been a cold monument to success, filled with silent rooms that reminded him of loss. But now each day he returned to something warmer. He would find Clara humming softly in the kitchen, the smell of bread or soup filling the air, or see her tending the roses in the garden. And when she looked up to greet him, there was no longer just formality in her eyes, but a quiet recognition of his humanity. He began to let go of his constant race for more business, more deals, more money. Meetings that once seemed impossible to miss were now easily postponed. He realized that what he had been chasing outside his home was already waiting for him inside. Clara had given him back a sense of peace that no fortune could buy. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with soft orange light, Mr. Lawson invited Clara to sit with him on the wide porch. They watched the garden glow in the fading sunlight. The air was cool and the world seemed still. "Clara," he said after a long silence, "I used to think that the measure of a man was what he built, the money he made, the respect he commanded. But I see now that none of it matters if you return each day to emptiness." Clara's hands rested on her lap. Her voice was gentle. "Loneliness makes even the biggest house feel small." "Sir," he turned his head to look at her. His eyes, once sharp and distant, now held softness. "You've given me back something I thought I lost forever," he said. "You gave me back my home." Her eyes grew warm, and though she tried to hide it, a faint smile touched her lips. "It was never lost, sir. It only needed someone to remember it." That night, Mr. Lawson made a decision. He walked through the mansion, pausing at each room: the library, the dining hall, the music room where his wife once played, and finally, the study where he had spent so many nights alone. He realized these rooms did not need to remain monuments of grief. They could be places of life again. The next morning, he called for Clara. Together, they began making small changes. The study was cleared of unopened boxes that had gathered dust. The music room was opened, its piano polished. Flowers were placed in corners of the house. Not just in the garden, for the first time in years. Laughter returned, soft at first, but real. Word began to spread quietly among neighbors and business associates. They noticed Mr. Lawson was different. He smiled more. He attended fewer late-night meetings. He seemed lighter. Some whispered questions arose about why, but he paid them no mind. What mattered was not what the world thought, but the truth inside his own home. As the months passed, anniversaries and birthdays no longer arrived with dread. Clara continued her quiet traditions of honoring Mrs. Lawson, but now she did so with his participation. Together they would light candles, share a meal, and tell stories. It was no longer a lonely ritual, but a celebration of a life well lived. One particular evening marked the resolution of his journey. Mr. Lawson stood in the garden, watching Clara as she trimmed the roses. He thought of how far they had come, from silence and grief to companionship and respect. He stepped closer and said, "Clara, you are not just the caretaker of this house. You are the heart that kept it alive when I had forgotten how to breathe. From now on, I want you to see yourself not as my maid, but as part of my family." Clara's hands trembled as she lowered the scissors. She turned to him with wide eyes. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," he replied softly. "You've already said enough in your actions." More than anyone else ever has, tears filled her eyes. Not of sadness, but of relief. For years she had worked quietly, never asking for recognition, never expecting more, and now to be seen, to be valued beyond her role, was a gift greater than any riches. From that day forward, the mansion no longer belonged to one lonely man. It became a home once more, a place where memories of the past were honored, but where new ones could also grow. Mr. Lawson no longer walked the halls in silence. He walked them with purpose, with gratitude, and with the quiet strength that came from knowing he was not alone. And Clara, though she remained humble in her duties, carried herself with a new kind of dignity. She was not just a maid, not just a background figure in someone else's story. She had become part of the very fabric of the life she had so carefully preserved. The resolution was not about grand gestures or dramatic changes. It was about small, steady step, the kind that transform grief into gratitude, loneliness into companionship, and a house into a home. Years later, when people spoke about Mr. Lawson, they no longer spoke only about his fortune or his success. They spoke of a man who had changed, a man who had discovered the true measure of wealth. It was not in numbers, not in the land he owned, nor in the companies that carried his name. It was in the life he had built within the walls of his home, a life shaped not by luxury, but by kindness and loyalty. He often thought about the day he came home early, the day everything shifted. At first, he had believed it was just a small act of thoughtfulness by Clara, but in truth it had been the beginning of a rebirth. That one gesture, a decorated table, a simple cake, a song on the piano, had unlocked a part of him that he thought was buried forever. Now, when the anniversary of his wife's passing came, the house did not fall into silence. Instead, it became a place of light. Clara would help him prepare a meal. They would light candles and place roses on the table. And instead of tears alone, there was laughter too. Stories of the past were told not with pain, but with warmth. His wife's memory had become a bridge, not a wall. Mr. Lawson realized something profound. Grief never truly leaves. It becomes a companion, sometimes heavy, sometimes quiet, but it can also be softened when shared. Clara had shown him that. She had carried part of his burden without asking, and in return, she had given him back his life. He often found himself walking through the garden, pausing by the roses Clara cared for so faithfully. To him, they were more than flowers. They were symbols, reminders that beauty can continue to bloom even after loss. Each petal told him a truth he had once ignored. Life goes on, and it can still be good. Clara, too, reflected on how her life had changed. She had never sought recognition or honor. She had simply wanted to serve with honesty. But through her loyalty, she had found a place in the world far greater than she imagined. The mansion was not just her workplace anymore. It was her home, and in it she found dignity, respect, and a sense of belonging she had never known. Over time, their bond became something people in the town whispered about. Some could not understand it. A millionaire and his maid sharing a life of quiet companionship. But neither Mr. Lawson nor Clara cared for the whispers. They knew the truth. They knew what they had built. The reflection of their story lived in the little things, in the way Mr. Lawson paused at the table each morning, grateful not for the wealth around him, but for the simple presence of someone who cared. In the way Clara smiled more freely now, her steps lighter, because she no longer walked as a shadow but as someone valued. Looking back, Mr. Lawson often thought about how blind he had been. For years he had lived surrounded by silence, convinced that money would fill the void. But money could never replace kindness. It could never replace loyalty. It could never replace the human connection he had ignored. It was Clara's quiet gestures that had taught him the greatest lesson of all, that even in wealth, it is the small, heartfelt acts of love that matter most. As he grew older, he no longer feared the empty chair at the dining table. It was no longer a symbol of loss, but a reminder of memory. And now there was always someone sitting across from him, someone who had turned his grief into strength. In his final years, Mr. Lawson often wrote in a small leather-bound journal. His words were simple but powerful. He wrote about his wife, about the journey of building his fortune, but most of all about Clara. "A home is not built of stone," he once wrote. "It is built of the hands that care for it, the hearts that keep it alive. She gave me back my home, and in doing so, She gave me back myself. Clara would one day find those words long after he was gone, and when she did, tears would fill her eyes, not of sorrow, but of deep gratitude. She would know that her life had mattered in ways far greater than she had ever expected. The reflection of their story was not about romance, not about wealth, but about humanity. It was about how one simple act of kindness can change the course of another's life. It was about how grief, when shared, can transform into something softer. It was about how the quietest people often carry the greatest strength, and so, the mansion that had once been a symbol of loneliness became a symbol of hope, not because of its size, its riches, or its beauty, but because within its walls lived a truth that all people search for. That in the end, what matters most is not how much we own, but how deeply we are seen, remembered, and cared for. That was the legacy of Mr. Lawson and Clara, a millionaire who came home early and discovered that the richest gift of all was the loyalty of the woman who had been there all along.